Thanks for your company on AM Agenda. Joining me now is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, and Labor MP Amanda Rishworth. Good morning to both of you and thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you, David. Good morning, Amanda.
First to you, Josh Frydenberg. The trip to Indonesia by Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, is being seen as a success, but largely because he dialled back that hairy-chested rhetoric on asylum seeker policy. Do you think there is any urgency to implement some of the more controversial elements of that policy, to turn boats around, to buy boats back in Indonesia, or will these elements just be left in the bottom drawer unless they're really needed?
Well, firstly, I think you're absolutely right, David. It was a very successful trip by the Prime Minister to Indonesia. His first trip overseas and very consistent with his Jakarta focus as opposed to a Geneva focus. It's also important to note that Indonesia is such a key economic partner for Australia, a country of 250 million people, $15 billion of two-way economic trade, a rising middle class, and we work cooperatively together with the Indonesians in groups like APEC and the East Asia Summit and the G20. Obviously, the border protection issue is of paramount importance to the coalition government, and we need to get it right, and we need to do that in partnership with Indonesia, and that's all elements of the policy that we announced before the election. One of the real breakthroughs from this visit is the Indonesians saying that they want to work bilaterally with Australia, not just through multilateral regional processes. And I think that's a really important announcement by the President, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and that will mean that we will be able to carry out our policies as promised before the election and be much more successful, David, than Labor has ever been in stopping the boats.
So under that bilateral approach, you do believe that boats will be turned around at sea?
Well, we have said we will turn around boats when it's safe to do so, and that does not breach Indonesia's territorial sovereignty. We've been very clear and very consistent about that, and Tony Abbott also said there'll be no surprises to our approach as well to the Indonesians. So I think, you know, this will be a partnership between Australia and Indonesia because it's in our both countries' interests to stop the large number of deaths at sea and the large number of boats that have been making their way to Australia. It's in both countries' interests, and we can only do it by working together.
Amanda Rishworth, Labor said that Tony Abbott didn't have the diplomatic skills needed to be able to walk the world stage, but he does seem to have pulled off this first trip overseas. Would you agree?
Well, look, what we've seen from Tony Abbott is pretty much walking away from his election commitments, walking away from turning back boats, walking away from the fact he said before the election he was going to do turn back boats and buy back boats, despite what Indonesia would think. We've seen him learn a pretty, I think, big lesson here, is you can't tell Indonesia what to do. Now, that was what he was saying before the election. We've seen him obviously dressing that down a lot and actually not really committing whether he would ever turn back a boat, whether or not he'd ever buy a boat. So I think he's learnt pretty quickly that you can't tell Indonesia what to do. Now, what we did see earlier last week was that the Foreign Minister actually of Indonesia released minutes of a meeting. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. So the relationship was going pretty badly in the first couple of weeks. Now what we've seen is Tony Abbott really back away, really change his rhetoric, actually realise, and probably because he's been told by Indonesia, you just can't do what you said you were going to do.
Josh Frydenberg, it is a very different message from the Prime Minister now to what he was saying throughout the election campaign and indeed over the past 3 years when it comes to asylum seeker policy.
Well, look, the Labor Party, conducted their traditional scare campaign during the election, saying, as you said, David, that no foreign leader in the region will deal with a Prime Minister called Tony Abbott. Well, that's quite the contrary to what's just happened in the last 24 hours, and he's conducting himself...
Is that because of the different message that he's presenting?
No, what he's saying very clearly is that we will stick to our election commitments, that we'll be much more successful in stopping the boats, and that we'll do that in partnership with Indonesia. And you've got to work with the region. You've got to work with our near and important neighbour, Indonesia.
Well, that was not the message before the election, Josh.
To Australia have been Indonesian flagged, Indonesian crewed, and departing from Indonesian ports. And Scott Morrison and Julie Bishop have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes with their counterparts in the region to try to get the result that we got in the last 24 hours. So I think it's something to celebrate for Australia that we've been able as a coalition government to do something in our first week or two that Labor never achieved, and that is to be able to engage bilaterally
you
with
have walked
Indonesia
away.
in addition to the regional processes. And may I say, David, that Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, in dealing with the region, is very much in the mould of John Howard. I mean, John Howard dealt with 5 Indonesian presidents over his time as Prime Minister, and in that time he had very strong, constructive, productive relationships. He even went to Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's inauguration in 2004. And
Amanda Rishworth, a quick response, and then we'll move on.
Well, look, Tony Abbott had extreme rhetoric before the election. He's walked away from that now. He's walked away from turning back the boats. He's walked away from buying back the boats, and he's walked away from spying on Indonesians in their ports. I mean, this is because he's been dressed down by the President of Indonesia to say you just can't do that. Instead, we're hearing the language that Labor was using before the election, let's work bilaterally. But of course, Tony Abbott said, no, we will not do that. Now he's saying we will. What we're seeing is a complete walking away from his election commitments about how he was going to deal with the issue of people smuggling.
Okay, no,
turning
Josh,
around the boats, buying back the boats. How are you going to buy back the boats? I mean, Indonesia has said that's unilateral, and now Tony Abbott's saying we'll only do things that are bilateral. I mean, it's clear that he's walked away from his commitments.
Okay, I want to turn to some domestic issues. And overnight, the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, took to the stage once again in conversation in Melbourne. And she is standing by her decision as Prime Minister to shift single mums onto the New Start allowance, better known as the dole. Let's have a listen.
I mean, I know it's controversial, but I'm going to stand up for it as a decision of the government I led. The rate of New Start is too low, and the approach we take to assisting people who are unemployed, I think, is not flexible enough.
Amanda Rishworth, do you believe that single mothers should stay on the New Start allowance, or should they have their own arrangements?
Well, look, that'll be something for the Labor caucus to discuss. Obviously, both Anthony Albanese and Bill Shorten have said they are concerned about that policy and want to revisit it. Certainly, that'll be something that will be discussed in caucus. But I think one of the critical things that Julia Gillard was talking about was the importance of breaking the cycle of disadvantage through encouraging the dignity of work. The government that she led did a lot of work in that area, including, for example, uncapping the places in disability employment services, trying to help people with a disability get the support they need to get into work. So that was a big focus of hers. Now, that was in terms of the single parenting payment, that is one part of that, and that's something obviously Labor will look at and has been signalled by both leadership candidates. But we can't take away from the fact that the focus and so much work was done and so much success was actually done in getting people to work, breaking that cycle of generations of unemployment, and we need to continue to pursue that work, not do little things like just say you've got to go and turn up here or turn up there, work for the dole, but really things that provide long-term employment opportunities for people that have experienced unemployment for a long time.
Josh Frydenberg, is there scope for the dole, New Start, to be raised, to be increased?
Oh, look, that's a question for the relevant minister, Kevin Andrews, but it's very clear, David, that Labor's tying itself in knots here. You've got the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, coming out and saying that her decision was right. You've got the two candidates, Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese, campaigning for the leadership, saying that they want to change the policy. I mean, I know Bill Shorten was the one who introduced the policy as a minister. A few months later, he's running for an elected position in the Labor Party, and he's changing his position. I mean, where are the principles that he had, on this to start with? So I just think this is an internal Labor issue. They're completely divided about it, and we have a policy, and, if there's going to be any changes, that's a matter for Kevin Andrews and the Cabinet.
OK, I just want to get both your thoughts as well on what has been reported over the past couple of days in relation to Senator George Brandis and his expenses, some on travel, which he's now paid back, and some $13,000 that was billed to the taxpayer on books. Now, all of them within the guidelines of politicians, but Josh Frydenberg, satirical cartoons and political fiction and the like, is that something the taxpayer should be paying for?
Well, in terms of the books, I mean, as George Brandis made very clear, party members from both sides of the political divide are acting within their entitlements. I notice Andrew Leigh has spent thousands of dollars on books himself, and George Brandis was the Shadow Minister for Arts and now is, the Minister for Arts. In terms of the other entitlements, he paid that back, and, this is a very grey area. And, there's a list as long as my arm, David, of Labor members like Julia Gillard and Tony Burke and Don Farrell and Michael Danby, who've all paid, paid back their own entitlements. So Labor should be very careful about pointing the finger here, because there's more members of their side who've done this.
Will you point the finger at all in relation to this? Just 20 seconds we've got left.
My concern is the hypocrisy of George Brandis. He would not, he pursued Peter Slipper's alleged misuse of money. He did not allow Peter Slipper to pay that back. Instead, he sent it to the federal police. There seems to be one rule for George Brandis and another rule for others when it comes to these entitlements. Under George Brandis's rules, this would have been referred straight away to the federal police, as he wanted to do with Peter Slipper. So it seems there's a sense of entitlement with George Brandis and severe hypocrisy.
Amanda Rishworth, Josh Frydenberg, we'll have to wrap it up there, but thanks so much for your time this morning. After the break, we'll take a look in depth at the US government shutdown. Don't go away.